Be who you are. And that's one thing that you do such a beautiful job of, is be who you are. And because students aren't going to believe it, why would they listen to what you have to say and knowledge transfer if they think you're a phony and a weirdo fako, right? Like they're who is this clown person that's talking to me, right?
Hello. My name is Jacob Miranda.
And I'm Cassie Witt.
Now, Cassie and I are doctoral students here at the University of Alabama, specifically in the experimental psychology program, where we're concentrating in social psychology.
Together, we are the hosts of Corrupting the Youth, a podcast about the teaching of psychology. If you love psychology, education, or both, this is the podcast for you.
And welcome back, beautiful people.
Hello.
There we go. I like that. I was going to say, Cassie, we're kind of doing this recording a bit backwards, right? So like today's a very special episode, very special recording, because we're actually doing our first interview, or we just did our first interview.
Yeah.
And you would think, like how time works, you would start with the introduction and then you would do the interview. And so the interview just chronologically follows. But you and I decided to do the interview first, and we're like, you know what? We can record the intro after the fact and just we'll edit this in the beginning.
It's fine. The magic of editing.
But yeah, we actually got to talk to two very special people today, and we're really excited to share them with you.
Yeah, two of our favorite teachers in the whole world were our two instructors of teaching of psychology here at the University of Alabama, Dr. Ansley Gilpin and Dr. Alexa Tullett. Both of them are associate professors in the Department of Psychology here, and Ansley is actually our director of graduate studies. Both of them are just amazing, inspiring teachers, and they train our teachers here, and we were very, very lucky to have them come on the podcast today.
Definitely. They are essentially meta teachers. They teach those who teach. Cassie, I haven't asked you this before, but like, who was your TOP instructor, right? Because they sometimes switch it off. Because I had Ansley.
Mm-hmm. I had Alexa.
You had Alexa, so we got both their experiences. And like I said, I can definitely vouch for Ansley, and I'm sure you can definitely vouch for our mentor as well. So it's it's really cool talking to them, especially since they're incredibly busy people. And we're asking them to interview through a summer after the semester just ended. And they probably like, I just wanted to spend time with my family and not do interviews. They're like, I just want to live my life. Ansley does some interesting work where she's a cognitive-developmental psychologist. I think she works, I think her lab's called the Kids Lab.
Yep, the Kids Lab.
And we're going to link their websites for both of them for those of you who are interested. But she really looks at imagination and play in children, and looks at that as a cognitive skill and what that's associated with, which is really cool because she's just extremely passionate. And how some people are activists in the political realm. She definitely is that, but she's definitely an activist for kids. And I'm it's hard to really go against that, right? Who's going to be anti-child protection? So I'm she does some real cool advocacy work. But then we also have obviously our direct mentor that we mentioned, Alexa, who's a meta scientist, very involved, has her own podcast that we can possibly link. She has two. One that she finished up, and the second one that's ongoing. So that's 2 Beers for Psychologists that's ongoing. And then the Black Goat is the one that finished about a year and a half ago. So if you really like what they're saying or you want to learn more about them, just click those links. But other than that, I hope you all enjoy the interview. Cassie, any last words?
Keep on corrupting the youth.
Jesus. You're cringing me, Cassie. You're cringing me. All right. So next time you're going to hear our voices, there might be a little bit of music in between. You get to hear Dr. Ansley Gilpin and Dr. Alexa Tullett. See you later. Hello, beautiful people. Welcome back. So with us, we have the two people we mentioned beforehand, Ansley and Alexa. And so Cassie and I were going to be starting our first interview with y'all. So, be kind to us. But I think the first general question especially if people like don't know who you are, is could you give us an introduction? So basically, can you give us a background on your education, kind of like how you were trained, your current research interests, and like how you got to where you are now here at UA?
Go first, Ansley.
Okay. I'm Ansley Gilpin. I am a developmental psychologist, an associate professor at the University of Alabama. And I originally, right out of undergrad, was a software trainer. And I was trained in corporate training and did that for a while. And then went to graduate school because I just really wanted to be a psychologist. So I went to graduate school. And so I've always really enjoyed kind of learning about pedagogical techniques. And I just think it's really interesting. So it's a little background.
And what do you do research on as well? Is it on pedagogy, or I believe you're
not as much. I'm a cognitive developmental psychologist. So I look at how children learn and how they're set up for success in terms of their overall well-being, but specifically in terms of their imagination and how they develop imaginative skills, which is a cognitive skill related to general cognitive functioning as well.
Very cool. What about you, Alexa?
So I went to school for psychology. So I've never experienced anything outside of psychology. I did my PhD in Toronto, and then I moved to Alabama. I'm trained as a social psychologist. And I sort of did a bait and switch when I got hired at Alabama. So I told them I was a psychophysiologist, which was sort of true at the time. But since then have basically abandoned psychophysiology as an approach and now do more research on metascience. And I would say that I do a little bit of research on pedagogy, but really that's you two.
Yeah, that's fair.
I feel like somewhere on the website, there's a picture of you, Alexa, with just like an EEG cap somewhere. I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere in my memory.
Yep. I thought I had gotten rid of all of those. I had scrubbed the system.
I was a little worried when I first came to work with you. I was like, oh no, she's going to make me learn how to do this, but I'm glad you did. Okay. So our next question is, how are you trained as teachers? So as grad students, did you have a teaching of psychology class, or did you have any formal training in the teaching of psychology? And then based on your experiences and your training, how did that influence your current teaching philosophy?
Well, I could answer this because my answer is short. So basically the answer to how I was trained to be a teacher is I wasn't, pretty much. So in my grad program, teaching really wasn't emphasized. And my advisor, Mickey, he was really a research focused kind of psychologist. And so, and he knew that to get a job at an R1 school or something like that, that the more time you can spend on research and the less time you can spend on teaching, the more you'll be sort of recognized in the hiring process, at least at the time. And for the kinds of jobs that he thought I would want and I thought I would want at the time. So my only teaching experience in grad school was I co-taught a seminar class. And even that was sort of discouraged. So I got a tiny bit of teaching experience, but there was no designing a class or coming up with my own assignments. I just sort of did. Basically, somebody was on maternity leave and I sort of half took over the class with somebody else. And then when I got to Alabama, I guess they just sort of assume that you can teach once you get here. So there's no training. I think probably TAs get more training. I never had a TOP type of class. And I think you asked something about how that affected our teaching or something like that, which for me was just I think I was quite a bad teacher for a while because I was mostly learning through trial and error. Ansley's shaking her head, but she doesn't remember. There was a reason that I only taught social studies one time, I'm pretty sure.
No, I don't believe you. I was here. I remember you were great at it from the go. And one of the reasons that you're great at it is because you're interesting, right? So I actually was trained, both corporate and then And then my graduate program at the University of Texas at Austin also had a pedagogy class. So it worked a little differently than ours at the University of Alabama, but we first took the class and then we picked a teaching mentor, and that teaching mentor mentored us through our first teaching experience. And at the time, it was usually our only teaching experience. You really were lucky to get one. So that was my experience. So I had a limited experience, but I think that the corporate experience and training before was pretty useful.
Kind of what went into the, I guess, corporate training, as well as kind of like, your teaching philosophy now. I know like when we took TOP with you, you even had us like kind of figure out our own philosophy and like help us write that down. So I was kind of curious of like what your personal one was.
My personal, oh gosh. Yeah, I probably should have reminded myself about my personal teaching philosophy. No, in general, I think so. One of the, at the time when, I don't know what they still teach in corporate training, but at the time, a big point that they made that almost every training I ever went to about training, about pedagogy, was that you have to make it relevant to the learner. So it needs to be, whatever you're teaching them needs to be relevant, ideally applicable, interesting. And I don't mean edutainment, like, but rather like useful and actually engaging and interesting. Right. And so I think that that's a tenet of my teaching philosophy, is I try to make the students, give them examples how they can apply it to their life, but also try to encourage them to apply these principles to their lives and their future career goals, so that they, have some direct connection to the material a little bit better.
And it's kind of a side question based off both y'all's responses. I know, Alexa, you said that you kind of like half co-taught or co-taught with someone during graduate student, and then Ansley, I think you said during your experience you only taught one course. Do you feel like that's, I guess, enough? So like for someone, like, do you feel like, one, do most students, and I don't have a general idea of like the prevalence of this. So like, do you feel like most grad students do at least teach around once? And then also, do you feel like that one time is enough? Or like, do you feel like there should be, if you could change it, more or less based off if it's an R1 institution, about like how much teaching experience someone should get in their like graduate student career?
I guess in some ways, I think like you can't really prepare for teaching without teaching. And the first students that you get will likely not get as good of an experience as the students who get you when you're more experienced and you've learned more. So I don't know that from the institution's perspective, I guess you would get more information about whether somebody is a great teacher if they had taught more than one class. Like, I think it's probably pretty hard to interpret like student opinions of instructors from having taught just one class and things like that. But in terms of like your impact as a teacher or something like that, I think you just kind of have to learn as you go. So whether that's at your graduate institution or the place that you ultimately get a job, I'm not sure how much it matters really. I think one thing that ends up happening to people, this happened to me, is that I really had no idea like whether I liked teaching or not when I got my job. And so I ended up getting a job at a place that is, not the least teaching focused place, but it's not like a liberal arts college or something like that. So I think, for students who are going on the market, having very little teaching experience might mean that they don't have as much insight into how much they want to teach in their career.
All right, for the next formal question. So we kind of talked about the class of teaching of psychology. I think it's in the title of our podcast or in our name. And Ansley, you talked about like a pedagogical course where it was run differently than how we run it here. So like you can imagine that there might be a listener who's like never heard of like, what do you mean there's a teaching psychology class? What goes into that? How does one lead or instruct that? So I was kind of wondering, like, if you either of you can talk about like what is TOP to you, like how is it structured, how is it run, as well as the students in there, like what's your end goal as kind of being this meta teacher? So like you have these people who are teaching for the very first time, they're going to be teaching 101, and by the end of the semester, you hope that they, as nascent teachers that are emerging, Like, what do you want out of that by the end of the semester? What would you like to see as the most ideal?
Yeah. So I think with teaching pedagogy, there are a few things. So you're actually teaching the science behind pedagogy and what techniques work and what techniques maybe are not as successful. So there's some just knowledge transfer, a little bit at least. The good thing is that we're all psychologists training to be psychologists. So we have a kind of basic understanding, even if you study something vastly different, of memory and learning. And so at least we have a little bit of foundation there. So that reach is not so hard. So there's some basic knowledge transfer in terms of pedagogical techniques. And then I think there's the rest of it is predominantly a guide. So I kind of think of myself more as a guide. There's some practical things that I try to communicate, like how to physically build a syllabus and what rules, if you will, in a syllabus would be a really good idea and which ones are probably not a good idea, which ones are illegal. So there's some basics that I think, are easier if somebody just communicates to you. And then for the rest, I think it's a guide in helping somebody find their own style and their own voice. And I don't think that there is one teaching style. I know there's not. I've seen so many highly, highly effective instructors that are vastly different from each other. And I think that's a good thing. I think students need to see they're going to connect to different people for different reasons. And so I like first to kind of guide and let students find their own voice. But the other thing that I think is really important is we're not just teaching people to be teachers in a classroom to undergraduate students, right? It's more, how do you disseminate knowledge in a clear way? So I think this is transferable to things like, how would you write a one-pager to send to legislative staff? How would you communicate to doctors or principals or superintendents in your area about what they need to know given the current research findings that are relevant to them? So I think it's more about disseminating information in general, and people have a style. They're going to develop their own style. And I just hope that at the end of my goal is that they are comfortable. They develop a comfortable and effective style.
And I really like this idea of like taking a step back from not just teaching specifically, but just science communication in general, because that is effectively what we're doing as in the classroom. We're trying to communicate the science, but it can be applied and it can transfer to other domains.
Yeah.
And I think what's interesting about TOP is that, Ansley, sometimes you teach it, but sometimes Alexa, you also teach it. So I'm sure like you have almost a distinct style. Like there's probably some similarities, but also maybe some unique stuff that you do as well.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. I always hear people telling me how great Ansley is at teaching TOP. So I think that
same.
I don't know if it's allowed for me to ask questions since you guys are interviewing, but I'm like, I don't know all of these things about you, Ansley, and I'm like curious. So why'd you switch from industry to academia? And did you like always want to be a teacher, or were you like more into being a researcher?
I wanted to work with kids and be a psychologist, and it was just a really good job. So I just happened to graduate in a really, really good economy. I know that's super braggadocious, and they were flying us all over the country to interview for jobs because they just didn't have enough people. So this is also right before Y2K, right? And so they were just desperate for anybody they thought could program for the end of the world, right? And so all kinds of things, right? So I just ended up in corporate training through this way. So that was kind of fun, but I always wanted to be a psychologist. I had planned on doing that before. It was just a little.
So was that a legitimate thing? Just like, just in case of what would we do? And like, let's just prep for it by the corporate world, or?
No, they were like changing all the programming to be 4 digits instead of 2 digits.
Gotcha. Mm-hmm. I was just that's.
And so they just didn't have enough programmers in general. So they were just hiring massive amounts of freshly BA'd undergraduates that they were going to teach like Fortran and all kinds of these really old programming techniques to try to, save it. Anyway, long story short, this is just a quick aside, but it's so entertaining. On the year 2000, I was in New Orleans on a roof and it was really foggy and people were setting off fireworks, but you couldn't tell that they were fireworks because it was so foggy. And I was like, fireworks. massive gun explosions. I'm not really sure, given how we've set up Y2K, what's happening right now.
Oh man.
Fireworks. It was fireworks.
Ansley is like my favorite person these days for 90s references that I know my students wouldn't get. Like Y2K, I haven't thought about that in ages.
I know.
Also the other day we were in a meeting together and she texted me and she was like, well, I just about had something about Mary here before I got into this meeting. And I was like, wow, I haven't thought about that movie in a long time.
Because I'm old, man.
Same.
Okay. So we are imagining that most of our audience is probably graduate students or people who are pretty early career. And so as like some seasoned TOP teachers, like what are some of the most common challenges that your TOP students like face or like bring to you? And then in that line, like what's some of the most common advice that you find yourself giving to like first-time teachers or early teachers?
A couple of things come to mind for me. So Ansley mentioned, one of her roles as a TOP teacher, like making sure that you don't create a syllabus that's a disaster. So I think this was true of me too. And I see this in my students, like sometimes it's easy to think you're going to be like really tough. And then it's like a lot harder to reinforce those policies. So people will have things in their syllabus like, no late discussion note submissions for any reason, period. Like we're not putting up with your bullshit excuses, but then it's like really different when you're talking to a student and they're like,
mother died or something.
Their mother died. They like got in a car accident and they're now in a wheelchair. Like, they deal with all kinds of stuff as we all do. So I think, that sort of like coming into it, without sort of anticipating the kind of like compassion that you would want to have in those situations. And then like another thing that I would be really curious if Ansley encounters this and what advice she gives is that I think one of the toughest things for being a first-time teacher is just like feeling the anxiety. Like a lot of people have just anxiety, like public speaking, but also just like, in a role where you're supposed to be the expert. And like, you have these like 19-year-olds like looking at you, like, and they just like, even I think one of the first things that I tell TOP students is like, just because students look that they're so bored that they want to die doesn't mean that they're not having a fine time in your class and like actually enjoying what you're saying, so you have to like get over that initial like visual negative feedback that sometimes you experience. But I think students pick up on anxiety in teachers and aren't always so forgiving of it. So like that can be a rough hurdle. And it's really, I don't know what advice. I think time is very helpful for anxiety and experience, but it's like kind of an unsatisfying piece of advice to be like, just wait it out. It'll get better. Maybe next semester.
Yeah, for real, right? Don't chum the waters.
I was going to say, as a follow-up to that with like the anxiety and kind of like how you appear to your students, do you feel like, is there different like gendered advice that you would give? So like for female instructors versus like male instructors. So like, I know in the literature, it's like men who like can dress worse for wear still get like evaluated as professionals and highlies. But, I think like you said, like students might not be forgiving. And immediately I think of like maybe female instructors where they always have to, wear the makeup, wear nicer clothes to be seen as an expert. Like, has that ever come across, or like have any of your students face like this almost like they're feeling lesser than because they're a woman or whatnot? It's more of like a personal curiosity question, if that's ever come up.
I would say more so, I think, for students who appear closer to the same age as the undergraduates. I mean, they may not be anywhere near their age, but they may just appear younger. That's a little bit more of a hurdle, but I would say that has come up a couple of times so there are things that you do when you want to feel. So just advise students to do the same thing that you do when you want to feel more in control and authoritative. And so I just encourage people. So one thing that I personally do is if I want to feel more prepared and in control and authoritative, I just personally like to wear my nicer clothes, like more professional clothes. It just puts me in that mindset. So that's just something that I do. I also like to, maybe print out my notes because it makes me feel, just makes me feel calmer. I've got my notes. I don't know. It just makes me feel calmer. I like to put them in a folder that looks clean because I don't know. It just makes me feel, organized and more prepared. I don't know. So I was looking back at my old notes or my old tests and stuff from 2008, 2009. And y'all, they were color coded, like rainbow color organized. Like it was just beautiful. I was like, oh, back in the day. And I very clearly needed this comfort of organization, like I home edited my entire, if you're familiar with that reference, my entire teaching curriculum, everything was just beautiful rainbow organization. But
that makes me That makes me think I feel like throughout this conversation, I've been talking about teachers getting better with experience. In some ways, I think that we get worse because you get lazier and you're not I don't color code anything anymore.
Your test might be in that pile. Good luck.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to dismiss. I think surely teachers experience sexism from students, and students may have different expectations and give the benefit of the doubt to male teachers over female teachers and, on many different dimensions. But I always found that advice frustrating, this advice that oh, if you're a woman teacher, you need to make sure that you are dressing this way. You can't put any, exclamation points in your emails or your students won't take you seriously, because I feel like that advice almost reinforces those perceptions or those stereotypes. And I have also never found it useful for me. So I was told that kind of thing when I first started here, and I tried to be more formal and more stern. And I don't think that I was as good of a teacher. It wasn't very natural to me. I think students felt they felt like it was awkward. And yeah. And then I think when I kind of dropped those pretenses, I became a better teacher and students could see that I was more comfortable. So I don't think that's good advice, but I do think what Ansley said of find what works for you, on the days that you need a boost, do the thing that gives you a boost that. I think that's great advice.
Yeah. And I think, Alexa, what you're pointing to is be who you are, right?
Yeah.
Be who you are. And that's one thing that you do such a beautiful job of, is be who you are. And because students aren't going to believe it, why would they listen to what you have to say and knowledge transfer if they think you're a phony and a weirdo fakeo, right? They're who is this clown person that's talking to me, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's about being authentic. Yeah. And then you find out that maybe you are a super compassionate person, or maybe you find out, oh, I really like rules. I mean, you just don't know, yeah.
There's some people who are great at being strict, actually. They, it's their jam, and students sometimes really like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ansley, I'm just imagining a trainer in front of you, and only thing going through your mind is, who is this clown? You're just sitting, you're listening, and that's the only thought through your mind is just no.
No. But we've all been to a talk or something where the person was just so off the walls that you were what is happening here?
Yeah. I recently heard someone describe teaching as a performance art, and I haven't stopped thinking about it since. And I think there is something very performative about what we do. We want to capture people's attention, and we want them to listen to us. And I think there is an art to it. But I'm wondering, do you guys agree with that? And then do you have, if you do agree, do you have any tips about how to become a better performer?
Especially since, Ansley, I think you used the term of what was edutainment.
Yeah. So I really appreciate your question, Cassie, because I think that being interesting, and engaging is very different than being vapid. This is not Netflix, right? This is you're conveying information, right? So I think, I think that they're different, but I also think that there are some people that are just have kind of a bigger, I'm not a personality researcher, so those personality researchers are going to cringe, but just have kind of a little bit more are a little bit more engaging, a little bit more entertaining than other people. And they tend to do, my experiences, they tend to do a little bit better in the classroom because they're just a little bit more interesting to watch. But I don't know that necessarily their students do any better in learning the material. Does that make sense? So I think they might be more popular because they're more interesting, but I don't know that necessarily they're a better teacher.
Yeah.
And I do think that there's an extreme where you're just so monotone and boring that you couldn't convey the information. So I think you're right, Cassie. There's like a sweet spot where you're interesting, engaging. Yeah. What do you think, Alexa?
I guess I think that it depends on like what you're going for as a teacher. So certainly like if you're mostly lecturing, you have big classrooms, I think there has to be a bit of a performance element to that. And, there are some people who they can just like talk for an hour or an hour and a half or whatever. And it's interesting to listen to them, and like, they're funny and they're personable. And I definitely think that, that is something that is a bit performative. I think that probably most people would be different in that role than they are just like having a conversation one-on-one. In general, I feel like I've been trying to shift my classes like more in a conversational direction or incorporating more sort of interaction with students. And in that case, I would say like, I'm sort of deliberately trying not to be performative. Like when I catch myself sort of like doing things that feel like kind of gimmicky, like coming into the class every day with like a current events question or something like that, I kind of try to push myself to like not do that, because I want it to feel more like, I want the boundary between like what I'm like outside of the classroom and in the classroom to be not that clear. So to just sort of like be myself, I guess. But that's, it's really different depending on whether you're lecturing or having a conversation with your students. I remember when I first started to record my lectures. So I taught one class in an asynchronous fashion during COVID, right? So like taking a video of myself and posting it online for students to watch whenever. And when I like just tried to be normal doing that, like recording myself talking, it was like, holy shit, this is boring. Like I can't even stay awake looking at myself. Right. So I was like, okay, I guess I gotta like bring some energy to this in my dining room somehow.
Oh, challenges of COVID. So much fun.
I do distinctly remember once, Alexa, very early on in my time here, like you had just taught like a big class and you were like talking about standing in front of everybody, like wearing a microphone. And you're like, this is the closest I'll ever be to being Taylor Swift.
There we go.
Yep.
It's true. That's funny.
Yeah. So talking about like challenges and advice that you often give your TOP students, do you have any stories of like something wild that happened where you were like struggling to come up with advice for a student?
I would say that occasionally I have a student that gets hit on.
Oh,
that does happen. I don't struggle for advice with that, but that does happen. And again, anecdotally, that tends to happen with the students that are closer in age to, So that does happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think the more struggle is, you also have to find, so there are clearly ethical boundaries that are very clearly wrong. And there are ones that are very clearly okay. And then there are kind of these little gray spots, right? That are, you sort of have to decide where you're okay in that gray zone. So social media is an example. Like I have decided I am not friending my students on social media, and I'm not going to accept a friend request. And I've just decided to set that rule up for myself because that just creates a clear boundary that just takes away anxiety. And if a student friends me for whatever reason, I just say, I'm so sorry. I don't, it just creates a clear boundary.
Right.
But I have had students that have said like, so this student asked if I would go with them and if my boyfriend and her boyfriend, and we could all go to dinner, what do you think about that? And I'm like, I mean, I don't, that's a little bit I mean, it's like dinner. I wouldn't, but I don't know. So, that's very different than like, having relationships with a student. That's very, it's really in that sort of gray. I mean, I would personally say it's a little too black for me, but so it's kind of advising students on these kind of awkward experiences that happen, and they don't want to be rude and they don't want to shut the student down and make them feel not appreciated. Right. But at the same time, there are some ethical boundaries.
Yeah.
That's kind of awkward.
It's sort of like that time that student asked you to be their friend, Alexa.
Yeah.
Like in person.
Like all of the awkward situations I can think of were just with me. They were not with my TOP students.
Can you tell that story?
Yeah. So I was like teaching a big lecture class, and it was like one of the earlier classes. Maybe it was the first lecture. And after the lecture, this student came up to me and he was like, "Hey, I was like wondering if I could ask you about something." And I was like, "Yeah, sure." And he was like, "Well, I'm like new to Tuscaloosa, and like I like don't really have like a lot of friends, and like you seem really cool.
Aww.
And like, would you be like willing to like be my friend?" And I was like, what do I say to this person? Like, I mean, and I was like going through my mind, like, okay, like, I have relationships with students where I get coffee with them like once every couple of months, something like that. So I can, sure. And I was like, sure. And then he was like, "I was just playing with you."
Thank God. That's hilarious.
Yeah,
and you were like, you are automatically getting an A because you are hilarious. That's funny.
Yeah. I also like, this is like, there's a lot of like cheating examples and stuff like that. I think students deal with a lot, or students who are teaching deal with a lot of, like plagiarism and academic misconduct and stuff like that. But I had this student once who was taking an exam, again, like a really big classroom. This is an in-person exam. And then I'm like walking around the room, like as one does. And I noticed that there's a person sitting under her desk.
Oh no.
And I was like, "What are you doing here?" And she was like,
Wait, Alexa, visualize that for me. So like someone's taking a test, they're sitting at a desk, and there's a second person immediately underneath them, just like on the floor.
Yeah. So it's like, it's hard to imagine. So it's in like an auditorium. So like the room rises as you go up. What? So this person is sort of like disguised behind some of like the chairs that are in front of her. And I was like, "What are you doing here?" And she wasn't in the class. And she was like, "I just got my wisdom teeth taken out and I need like someone to be with me while like post wisdom teeth surgery." And I was like, "What? No, you can't like find another friend. Like, what are you doing here?"
What?
So,
oh my gosh.
Just like bizarre things that students do.
So like around April Fools, Cassie and I released an episode basically of like times we were foolish and like big no-nos or big mistakes we made as teachers. And I was wondering, would either of you be willing to share kind of like a time that you were foolish, or you're just like, you look back on and you're like, "That was just a huge mistake on my part. I learned from it. I'm never doing that again." Like for my example, Ansley, I told them about the worm story here at UA, where I made them basically massacre a bunch of worms. And I would be like,
I'll never forget that, Jacob. That was so funny. Okay, it's terrible. It's completely terrible. PETA, don't come after me. But so
you were my guide. You were my TOP instructor at the time. And I just came to you and you're like, on your list of top 10, you said it made your list. And I'm like,
totally. Yes, that's definitely in there for sure. Yeah. That's pretty funny.
Let me give you some time, Ansley, because I have multiple that come to mind, but one is that I once gave students exams with the answers on them. So like the way that I used to create exams, I think this is still true. So maybe I haven't learned from this, is like I would have a key for the exam that has the correct answers, like in red or whatever like that. And then I have the actual copy of the exam. And so I usually create the key first and then like get rid of all the formatting and create the actual exam. And it was like, so it wasn't as bad as I'm making it sound. So it wasn't every question, but it was like, I had removed the formatting, but there was also like some diagram questions and I hadn't changed that. And so they just all had the exam with the answers to the diagram questions on it. But I've made several mistakes like that, which is, I think, if I can sort of like flip this into a positive, I think that's like one thing that's nice when I'm teaching TOP is that students are like, I mean, it's scary to think that you can make mistakes like that. Right. And I think students are really nervous, but there's always a solution, you just like figure it out. It's never the end of the world.
Yes. So I do remember. So one time many times I've had activities go wrong. And in this one particular instance, it was pretty funny. So I was playing sort of like a Jeopardy game, if memory serves, where students were supposed to sort of buzz in their answers to help them practice for an exam. And I didn't have any buzzers. But I did have bouncy balls that had come in. So remember, I'm a developmental psychologist. So sometimes we have prizes that we have. And so I did have bouncy balls. And so I told the students to lightly toss the bouncy ball to the front of the room when they knew the answers, forgetting that they were like the super bouncy balls and they bounced everywhere. And I got completely pelted by bouncy balls. The students didn't throw them at me, but they hit me anyway. So yes, sometimes activities don't go as planned and sometimes it turns out in a really funny way. But true story, don't use bouncy balls as your buzzers.
Well, thank you both so much for being here today and talking with us.
Yes, it was.
Yeah,
so
thanks
fun.
for having us.
Absolutely. We really enjoyed it. And of course, so your listeners know y'all are both amazing instructors and we're just the cream of the crop. And so we're just so thrilled to talk to you about pedagogical techniques and teaching and graduate school on your podcast.
Yeah, you guys are legit. People should follow all of your advice.
They should. Absolutely.
Award-winning.
Yeah.
Award-winning.
Literally.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah.
Like, so we appreciate you both again. Thank you for your time. And I think I'll wrap up the interview session. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Bye-bye. Hello again. We just want to thank you one more time for listening to Two Random Weirdos. If you want to listen to us ramble some more, we'll be posting episodes hopefully bi-weekly on both Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Fingers crossed.
If you want to get in touch with us, we can be found on Twitter and Instagram with the handle @CorruptYouthPod. Or feel free to email us at corruptingtheyouthpod@gmail.com. Thanks for listening and helping us spread the corruption. Bye.
Bye.